There's a bunch of boomer, middle-aged Western men, who have taken up the mantle of new atheism, who profess to be a brave new breed of atheists who are not afraid of speaking out against the evils of Islam and who are not afraid of being culturally comparative in comparing the superiority or the inferiority of different cultures. Well, there's nothing wrong with that in itself, as Islam is not a race. Not all cultures are at the same level of moral or spiritual or intellectual progress. That much I accept. However, many of the new atheists, if you read what they say between the lines, you will find that many of them are using atheism as a pretext for their colonialist undertones. Okay, so the people like Douglas Murray, Sam Harris, and Bill Maher, who are being applauded by the masses for being brave, outspoken intellectual rebels, for saying that Western values are superior to the values of the rest of the world, and most of the good in the world, as well as the world's moral and intellectual progress, comes from the West, and that all other cultures must adopt Western values to be counted as civilized nations. Okay, I quote Sam Harris, the American academic. Okay, so Sam Harris is an academic. He's a writer, a philosopher, and neuroscientist in America who is very, very, very popular among the atheist community. I'm atheist myself, but I personally don't subscribe to Sam Harris. The moment you start criticizing Sam Harris or questioning him, you unleash a torrent of wasps. His defenders will come stinging at you. They'll come at you like a torrent of wasps, saying things like you took his words out of context, or you're some Islamic apologist, or you're some lover of Islam, which I am none of. Okay, I'll quote Sam Harris. Now, this is in his podcast, The Myth of the Islamic Golden Age, which I will link in the description box so you can see for yourself what he said. You can read the entire thing, you can listen to the entire thing in context, and you don't have to say that I took his words out of context. Okay. It is not historically inaccurate, nor is it a sign of bigotry, to say that most of human progress occurred in the West. Science is a Western breakthrough. Liberal democracy, the rule of law, equality before the law, freedom of thought and expression, a universal declaration of human rights, separation of church and state. These are almost entirely Western conceptions. And when other cultures have adopted these, like Japan and South Korea, they have flourished. Okay. So, the amount of mental gymnastics you'd have to go through to arrive at this conclusion just baffles me. As if ancient China, India, and Egypt did not have their own rule of law. Now, there is archaeological evidence, in fact, that the concept of rule of law and rights existed in the East long before it came into any form of contact with the West. The stone tablets of Hammurabi, the Babylonian king, for instance, very clearly lists civil and national law, as well as the pillars of the Indian king Asoka, which very clearly stipulates the law of the land, individual rights, and also laws protecting animal welfare. So, non-Western cultures were not as backward and barbaric as you might like to think before they came into contact with the West. Okay, now in the Song dynasty in China, I'll have you know that we weren't torturing people for confessions like they were doing in Europe. You know, that at the same time in Europe, they had they were torturing people for confessions. They were doing things like trial by combat, trial by holding a brick. They were leaving it up to God to decide on a condemned prisoner's fate. Well, it's like in the Song dynasty, we already had a sophisticated legal system in place back then. In fact, the first university of the world to give degrees was founded by a Moroccan. You could argue that universities have existed since the time of antiquity, and even if you go back all the way to ancient India, you will find that the University of Taxila existed even before Cambridge, Harvard, and Oxford. The works of Greek thinkers like Aristotle and Socrates, whom white supremacists like Stefan Molyneux seem to have a boner for, these works would have been lost to existence had it not been for the non-white translators of the Arab world. And by the way, the first recorded secular king of the modern world was none other than the Mughal Emperor Akbar. It was not Queen Elizabeth I who praised Akbar for his humanity in bringing people of various cultures and religions together under one banner. And I can list a whole lot of pivotal scientific inventions such as paper, compass, gunpowder, convex lens, anesthetic, black ink, and at least 24 more that did not originate in the West. Now, suppose you thought that the scientific contributions of the East, of Eastern people, are negligible, and the majority of good things in this world that we enjoy thanks to technology is due to the West. Then I challenge you, Mr. Harris, I challenge you to go out of your house without buttoning your shirt, okay? Which buttons actually came from India. I challenge you to get a tooth pulled out without the use of anesthetic. And I challenge you to write a book without using black ink, which originated in Egypt. And how equal before the law were black people in Sam's country less than 100 years ago. USA, greatest country in the world. Now, less than 100 years ago, were black people allowed to use the same toilets as whites or sit at the same seats in a movie theater? I mean, his great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, back to the time of the Founding Fathers, probably even owned a few black slaves. Yeah. If you read the Declaration of Independence, which is considered the gold standard of human rights, and these neo-imperialists will point to it and say, look, we believe in rights for all, equality before the law. You'll notice that in their wording, they say that it is a self-evident truth that all men are created equal. But there is an unspoken clause, one unspoken clause that's not mentioned. A lot of people wonder why there's such a tremendous moral contradiction in the writings of these founding fathers. Like, supposedly they believe in the values of freedom, personal autonomy, and human rights, right? But at the same time, they were keeping black slaves. And in fact, Thomas Jefferson actually had several children with his black slave, whom he did not even bother to free before he died. And what is the relationship between a slave and a master? Can a slave truly consent to sexual intercourse between the slave and the master? So why is there such a tremendous moral contradiction? Well, that's because for most of modern history, the West did not consider certain people to be human. It's easy to say that all humans should have equality if you don't consider certain races like Africans, Aborigines, and Native Americans as human, right? So yeah, it's something that the colonialists, the neo-colonialists, I call them, have to address. It's a very very inconvenient truth that the neo-colonialists like Harris or Douglas Murray have to address. And this Sam Harris guy, even has the cheek to take the Indian practice of sati. Sati is the barbaric practice of widow burning, and to talk of it as if it was typical of Indian culture. Like he mentions about the case of the governor general who tells the Indian man that if you burn a woman to death, we will hang you. That is our culture. And Harris uses this to explain why Western culture is better than Eastern culture. You have the cheek to take the worst parts of a culture and compare it with the best parts of your own. If you cherry pick the worst elements of a culture and you compare it to the best elements of another culture, you will no doubt make the former look regressive compared to the latter. Now, if I flipped it around and told him his great 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 granddaddy owned black slaves and displaced Native Americans from their own soil to build farmlands, how do you think this guy would react? He would get extremely defensive and say, oh, no, we're not supposed to feel white guilt, So they're not supposed to feel white guilt. Why should Indians have to feel guilt about their practice of sati, the barbaric practice of sati, which was practiced by a fringe group of Indians, and was not accepted as the mainstream Hindu practice. And even before the British landed in India, the Indian kings were already banning the practice of sati, and you can look this up without me telling you the details. You can just Google it online, okay? Google Indian king ban sati. Now, if I flipped it around, they would get very, very defensive. People like Harris would get very defensive and say, I should not have to feel white guilt about what we did. Okay, what if I told you that Europeans of the same time period of sati thought of Aboriginals and Africans as subhuman, like I mentioned? Did you know that in that time they would exhibit racially inferior people at human zoos throughout Europe and America? Does India or China, do they have a culture of human zoos? Like, even up to the 1900s, it was generally considered an acceptable practice among the elites of Western society to have human zoos. Now, it was just their culture, right? We're not supposed to criticize them on the basis of their culture. So, are we? So it's just Western culture, we have to respect that, right? Oh, and what about the cruel and barbaric practice of bullfighting in Spain, in which bulls are tormented and tortured to death, as opposed to the Indian custom of venerating cows and treating them with respect? Now, if I use Harris's logic, I can compare and contrast these two elements of Indian and Spanish cultures, and in turn I could call Western culture cruel and barbaric. Now, pardon my confusion, but what exactly is brave, daring, or rebellious about parroting what our former colonial overlords had been telling us? Silly, ignorant natives for hundreds of years before we gained our independence, that we should be ever so grateful that they decided to grace us with colonialism? Am I supposed to listen to people like Harris gloating about the cultural milestones that the West has given Asia, ignoring, of course, the fact that the stripping the land of the resources and the impoverishment of the people of Asia? Am I supposed to listen to them and say, oh yes sir, I humbly acknowledge the inferiority of my backward and savage Eastern culture? There is virtually Nothing about my civilization of value to the world, nothing about my civilization to be proud of. All the joy in the world is thanks to you, oh great white savior. You Westerners are so brilliant and enlightened, and so moral and ethical, I'm not even fit to lick your boots. Fuck off. Okay, there's a guy named Bill Maher. Now, Bill Maher is a talk show host who spins himself, who calls himself a pundit as well. I mean, he indirectly calls himself a pundit on on geopolitical affairs, as well as society and culture. Bill Maher is very, very popular in America, and a lot of people consider him to be a comedian, but I consider him to be more of a propaganda minister. Okay, this is what Bill Maher was saying. Talk to women who have ever dated an Arab man. The reviews are not good. What is wrong with saying they're worse than other men, he means. Civilization begins with civilizing the men. Okay, I'm particularly disturbed about Bill's diction of using the word civilizing, as it reminds me of a poem entitled The White Man's Burden by Rudyard Kipling, who was a profoundly racist apologist for Western intervention in what many people termed as savage and barbaric Eastern countries, who considered it the moral responsibility of good, decent white folks to civilize the half-devil and half-child natives. Now, these are Kipling's exact words. Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best you breed, go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness on flutter folk of wild, your new-caught sullen peoples, half-devil and half-child. You know, I don't think Bill gets it, but the days of the empire are over. It's the 21st century, not the 19th century. I know you'd love to play white savior, like some kind of John Smith, saving the poor, oppressed women of the East from the backward and barbaric Eastern men, inspired perhaps by some idea of some Joy Luck Club fantasy. But sadly, you only end up sounding like an apologist for Western intervention. I mean, this is the 21st century, you know. Now, see, if he had said Muslim man instead of Arab man, it would not have been racist, because quite palpably, Islam is not a race, right? I would not have a leg to stand on in my condemnation of Maher as a racist. But quite palpably, Arab is a race, just like Chinese, Korean, Indian, Italian, or Spanish, or Japanese is also a race. Indulge me in a thought experiment and swap the word Arab with Indian. Talk to women who've ever dated an Indian man. The reviews are not good. You know, civilization begins with civilizing the men. What's wrong with saying they're worse? I'm not insulting Indians, I'm just keeping it real. Don't you think that the American media would be up in arms against Mr. Maher? Don't you think that he would be making headlines if he'd said something like that? But in the post-9/11 days, it's somehow acceptable to make racially fueled, hateful statements against Middle Easterners, you know, under the guise of bringing civilization to their cultures. Okay, or what if you say, what's wrong with saying that Jewish men are worse than men of other ethnic groups? Now, I'm not insulting Jews, I'm just keeping it real. You're gonna sound like the author of Mein Kampf if you do that, won't you? Now, I'm not saying that misogyny is not an element of the Arab world. In fact, misogyny is a very, very troubling element of the Arab world that the people in the Arab world need to address. Yes, but the point is that, you know, many of these freedom fighters like Maher, these white savior freedom fighters, are unusually silent on the topic of Western misogyny. So when you criticize him for blatant expression of racism and, his fans will defend him with ardent fury by saying that you plucked his words out of context. It was talking about Muslim men from the Arab world. Really? Okay, let's revisit that quote. Talk to women who have ever dated an Arab man. Not Muslim man, Arab man. The reviews are not good. What's wrong with saying they're worse? Civilization begins with civilizing the men. Surely Maher, who professes to be a sophisticated and erudite academic, is not that daft so as to think that Arab and Muslim are interchangeable. Now, one is a race, the other is a religion. Surely he is aware that there are numerous Christian and even atheist Arabs, and Arabs, much like any other racial group, are not a monolith. The first thing you have to remember is that there's a world of difference between someone from Palestine and someone from Saudi Arabia. They're not a monolith. Secondly, there is nothing about a man's race that can tell you about his character, since, race and character are two different things. Unless, of course, you're a Nazi, then you might disagree with me. There are also Caucasian men and East Asian men who treat women like garbage, such as the red pill community. But Maher only plays feminist when it's convenient, when it concerns races he doesn't like, such as those dirty Palestinians who keep bombing those nice white Israelis. He could care less if non-Arab men were sexually harassing or verbally assaulting women, since I've never heard him talk about the red pill community in the West, which is an unimaginably misogynistic community of men with white nationalistic leanings who are gaining dangerously fast traction in the sphere of American politics. Now I ask you, who is a greater threat to the safety of American women? A random dude from Lebanon or Palestine who just so happens to be Arab, or a white man of the red pill community who gets into politics and starts rewriting the consent and abortion laws for women? And, Maher is not exactly free from misogyny either. Okay, I will quote, "Feminine values have become the values of America. Sensitivity is more important than truth. Feelings are more important than facts." Okay, another one by Maher. "Stop acting surprised that someone choked Tila tequila. The surprise is that someone hadn't choked the bitch sooner." Okay, yet with his profoundly racist diatribe against Arab men, he attempted rather hypocritically to point out misogyny in Eastern men. Fancying himself some John Smith on a golden horse, taking up the white man's burden, standing on a moral pedestal higher than any British imperialist's mantle, swooping in to save the oppressed women of the East from the savage and barbaric hordes of Eastern men. Okay, the truth is that we don't live in the days of yes tuan, no tuan anymore. So tuan is Malay for sir, and that's what we were accustomed to calling our British colonizers. Sir, sir, sir. Automatically, we met an Englishman, we would say, sir, sir, tuan, tuan, tuan. But these men, people like Maher and Harris, they seem to be laboring under the delusion that the world still worships white skin. White skin has a right to police the rest of the world. Everybody thinks that whites are gods, and we shall all toe the line like good little savages who don't know what's good for them. Now, I should make it very, very clear that I don't dislike Westerners. In fact, I have a lot of very good friends from Australia, who I still keep in touch with today, from my university days in Australia. But spending 4 years in Australia made me realize that the grass was not really greener on the other side. It is not to say that, Western people are in any way intellectually, culturally, or more morally superior to other people. It's just the narrative that we've been taught since the day we were born, because we still live in a world that is, well, I will get flack for this, but we still live in a Western dominated world. But times are now changing, as China is gaining traction, and not surprisingly, there are many people in the West who are very, very concerned with the rise of China. Because I think it's because of their, you know, when you look back at the past, if you go back to history, when a country gets, to be a world superpower like Britain was in the days of the empire, America still is, but when the value of a civilization is not so much determined by military power and muscular strength, but by spirituality and intellect, you will find that, well, Eastern civilizations will certainly be on par with the West. Now, I don't dislike Westerners, but I even hate Westerners, as well as Easterners and Africans, with a chauvinistic cultural superiority complex. So I regard people from the Chinese chauvinist community who think that Chinese are better than everybody else. I also regard them with contempt, I had an American colleague like that once, in the school where I used to teach. I used to teach in a language school. Man, every day I had to listen to him. I had to interact with him. I had to listen to him gloating about how great Western civilization was for the world. How much he hated Islam and Muslims, and how he wasn't a racist. He was just stating facts, even though he often made racially derogatory statements about Arabs. Like, he would say things like, "Oh, what a typical Arab Facebook page. Oh, Israel has been very, very restrained in their reaction. If it were me, I would be committing ethnic cleansing against my neighbors." Yeah, and he would say things like, "Oh yeah, women in Eastern society don't seem as equal as they are in our culture." Then why was he in the East if he hated it so much? Well, that's because he was getting a far better job offer over here, in terms of expat salary, than he could ever back in the United States. Yeah, so basically he was feeding off our hands while biting the hand that fed him at the same time. So he got fired eventually, but that's another story for another time, because he got fired because of too many student complaints, because the Arab students really didn't like him, and I don't blame them, because he always seemed to be looking out to fail them. Like, if we had an oral test, he would ask them, like, "Are you ready?" Now automatically they might say, "Inshallah, God willing," and immediately he would fail them. It's like he was trying to get them to fail. And I don't think it's any coincidence that he was also a big Sam Harris and Bill Maher fan too. This man who parroted Sam Harris and Bill Maher regularly, who believed that, he was like an enlightening force in Asia, come to help the backward and ignorant natives. Yeah, he was a Sam Harris and Bill Maher fan too. Okay, you know what the funny thing is? The funny thing is that uppity British colonialists of the past would complain about virtually everything about the non-Western world, such as the weather, the regressive and backward culture. Like in Winston Churchill's words, Winston Churchill, the former Prime Minister of Britain, said this: "I hate Indians. They are a beastly race with a beastly religion." And you should look up on the Bengal famine. Do some reading up on the Bengal famine. Okay, I'm not going to talk about it in this video in interest of time saving, but just look up the Bengal famine. They would complain about the natives, like King Edward VII called Aborigines filthy and nauseating. And he complained that his trip to the Australian countryside was ruined because he had to see natives. But if there was one thing they didn't complain about, it was the resources they were stripping the lands of, such as rubber, tin, gold, tea, porcelain, spices, and copper, to meet the ever-growing requirements of the Industrial Revolution, you know. They used bringing civilization to backward and unenlightened people, of course, as a pretext for their territorial ambitions, just like, so you know why neocons like Harris have openly supported Western intervention in the Middle East? He actually said in a debate with Noam Chomsky that Americans, although they may create collateral damage, have got noble intentions. They wish to do good for the world. That is, Harris should actually get himself. He should consider applying for the comedy club. I'll actually go for his shows just for the sake of ironic humor. Now, America has a proven track record of buddying itself with brutal despots such as Suharto and Batista and King Salman of Saudi Arabia. They sell the Saudi regime, which has an atrocious track record on human rights. They sell them weapons to bomb Yemeni people. So don't give me that crap about bombing the Middle East for noble intentions. I think that it was Martin Luther King who said that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. But even then, I think their intentions were anything but. The British imperialists used the same pretext for their foreign intervention in countries like India, China, and Africa. And believe me, it had nothing to do with humanitarianism or helping the natives. You know what the Americans love? Oh, they fucking love oil. And what better way to get cheap oil than by one day declaring regime change, kicking out some puppet dictator they installed in the first place. Like, another inconvenient truth is that the Americans were supporting Saddam even while he was gassing the Kurds, annexing a country and then laying claim to its resources, in this case oil fields. And what better way to justify your nation's conquest and plunder by framing it under the narrative of bringing culture and civilization to the savages.